Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. This is a section from Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. It's from chapter 5 of the book, which is titled From the 20th Congress of the CPSU to the Repression of the, quote, Prague Spring, end quote. Which, the 20th Congress took place in 1956 and the Prague Spring took place in 1968. So that's the era. It's the era this chapter's about, and the section that I'm reading from is Theories of a New Mode of Production, and the section I'm reading is about Milovan Djilas. For some time, Milovan Djilas, who lived from 1911 to 1995, was regarded as the most important theoretician of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Footnote: Djilas became a communist during his literary studies at the University of Belgrade. Sorry, straightening out my microphone here. Under the monarchic dictatorship of King Alexander, Milovan Djilas had spent a long time in prison. At the end of the 1930s, Milovan Djilas supported Tito in the battle for power in the Communist Party. In 1928, Djilas was elected to the Yugoslav Communist Party's Central Committee, and a year later became a member of the Politburo. It's important to know that Tito represented the Stalinist wing of the Yugoslav Communist Party, and for more information about the Yugoslav Communist Party and like the pre-World War II days, check out the piece I have on this channel about Trotsky and Ante Siliga. Ante Siliga writing the big book, The Russian Enigma. And also, or check out some of the pieces from my In the Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, edited by Sean Gamna, for commentary on Yugoslavian communism, but also, especially in the more recent book, the sections from that will be up eventually. This volume 2 of the Lost Texts of Critical Marxism has pieces about that are about like the what was Tito's role in pre-World War II Yugoslavian communism, and it was very much a Stalinistic role. Anyway, from 1948 to 1953, Milovan Djilas with Edvard Kardelji, maybe, I don't know if I'm saying that right, and Boris Kidrich, one of the architects of the Yugoslav system of self-management. In 1953, Milovan Djilas became vice president of Yugoslavia and chairman of the Federal Assembly. Because of Milovan Djilas' social criticism, Milovan Djilas was divested of all powers during an extraordinary party plenum in 1953 to 54. In the years 1956 to 61 and 1962 to 66, Milovan Djilas was again imprisoned as a dissident. See Reinhardt's 1981. That's a reference to a book by Dennis Reinhardt's from 1981 titled Milovan Djilas, a Revolutionary as a Writer. End footnote. After the split between Belgrade and Moscow, Milovan Djilas developed into a sharp critic of the Soviet Union. Partly inspired by the relevant writings of Trotsky, Milovan Djilas became convinced that the working class in the USSR no longer possessed any political power. In Milovan Djilas' 1950 pamphlet on New Roads of Socialism, Milovan Djilas had this to say about the Soviet Union. Quote, "In the Soviet Union, there are no economic bases for the creation of a new class. What is happening there, the outward manifestation of which we see, does not mean and cannot mean a return to capitalism. This is actually a matter of new phenomena, which arose on the ground and within the framework of socialism itself." End quote. Milovan Djilas. And that was from Milovan Djilas, 1950, on New Roads to Socialism, address delivered at the pre-election rally of Belgrade students, March 18th, 1950. From this although this passage still shows strong associations with Trotsky's "The Revolution Betrayed," this changed when in a subsequent text, Djilas accused the Soviet Union of bureaucratic, quote, imperialism, end quote. I mean, a lot of people would criticize the use of that term because imperialism ostensibly means something specifically, the highest phase of, monopoly, finance, capital, imperialism being like the supposed result of that, being what imperialism is proper. And anyone who uses the word imperialism to describe the Soviet Union, which is not based which is supposedly not based on, or I would argue it's not based, but since the Soviet Union is not based on financial capital, then what it's doing is not imperialist, or something like that. People say things like that. Even though conquest clearly is not something that is an expansionism of empires, is not something specific to modern capitalism. Anyway, although this passage still shows strong associations with Trotsky's "The Revolution Betrayed," this changed when in a subsequent text, Milovan Djilas accused the Soviet Union of bureaucratic, quote, imperialism. Then, Milovan Djilas argued that the ruling stratum, cornered by the growing contradiction between the productive forces and relations of production, sought a solution for the ruling stratum's internal problems by external expansion through the exploitation and subjugation of other countries. In Milovan Djilas' pamphlet, Milovan Djilas drew a clear and analytical distinction between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. Although Milovan Djilas noted bureaucratic tendencies in Milovan Djilas' own country, Milovan Djilas argued that these bureaucratic tendencies could not gain the upper hand in Yugoslavia, since the historical preconditions and the balance of power tended more towards the dismantling of the bureaucracy. Later, however, Milovan Djilas changed this assessment, and in 1953, Milovan Djilas began to express principled criticism about Yugoslavia itself. In a series of articles which caused Djilas' expulsion from the party, Milovan Djilas pointed to serious deficiencies of the Yugoslav system and to the danger of a despotism of the Soviet type. Parallel to this development was Milovan Djilas' far-reaching revision of Trotskyist theory. In the aftermath of the Hungarian popular uprising, Milovan Djilas published an article in which Milovan Djilas claimed that both in the Soviet Union and in Yugoslavia a new class, the communist bureaucracy, was emerging. In his book, The New Class, published in 1957, Milovan Djilas elaborated his theory that a new type of ruling class had been established. Milovan Djilas' analysis, which recalls the ideas of Ritzi, Burnham, Shachtman, and others, and did not pretend to be original, quote, almost everything in this book has been said somewhere else, ... end quote, focused centrally on the so-called political bureaucracy. This stratum should not, Milovan Djilas argued, be equated with the bureaucracy as such. Quote, only a special stratum of bureaucrats Those who are not administrative officials make up the core of the governing bureaucracy, or in my terminology, of the new class. This is actually a party or political bureaucracy. Other officials are only the apparatus under the control of the new class." End quote. Milovan Djilas. And that quote is from The New Class, an analysis of the communist system, published in 1957. So while on the one side the bureaucracy was a fraction of the whole state apparatus, the bureaucracy was, on the other side, only a fraction of the party apparatus. The party formed the heart of the class, but not all party members were part of the political bureaucracy. Only those bureaucrats who possessed special privileges as a result of their administrative monopoly belonged to the new class. In Djilas's view, the ruling, quote, political bureaucracy, end quote, differed from previous ruling classes. Milovan Djilas noted 3 essential deviations from the traditional pattern. After economic changes had already occurred within the old social relations, the political bureaucracy created its own economic system only when the revolution had succeeded. Quote, "It did not come to power to complete a new economic order, but to establish Quote, "It did not come to power to complete a new economic order, but to establish its own, and in so doing, to establish its power over society," end quote. Milovan Djilas, The New Class. Second, while earlier ruling classes had existed as classes already before the revolution, this was not the case in the USSR. There, the new class was formed definitely only after it had seized power. The consciousness of the vanguard of the new class was thus ahead of events. It already possessed the idea of its class power before it actually acquired power. Third, from this advanced consciousness followed another difference. In contrast with previous classes, the new ruling class could only emerge in an organization of a special type, the Bolshevik Party. Related to these, quote, birth defects, end quote, of the political bureaucracy, Milovan Djilas noted further differences with other ruling classes. The new elite had an exceptionally weak class consciousness. The average political bureaucrat was not even aware that the average political bureaucrat belonged to a new possessing class, although the average political bureaucrat knew that he belonged to a group with specific ideas, goals, and attitudes. Moreover, the political bureaucracy was more compact and more rigidly organized than any other ruling class, with the consequence that the political bureaucracy's power was historically unequaled. Quote, "Contemporary communism is that type of totalitarianism which consists of 3 basic factors for controlling people. The first is power, the second is ownership, the third ideology, ... No totalitarian system in history, not even a contemporary totalitarian system, with the exception of communism, has succeeded in incorporating simultaneously all these factors for controlling the people to this degree." End quote. The history of the USSR could, Milovan Djilas argued, be divided into 3 phases: the revolutionary communism of Lenin, the dogmatic communism of Stalin, and the undogmatic communism from the mid-1950s, featuring an ostensibly collective leadership. Schematically, the differences between the 3 periods can be summarized as follows. So the first period, the revolutionary period under the leadership of Lenin, had a relation to power. Its relationship to power was, power is seized, the foundations for the rule of the new class are established. In the quote, dogmatic period, Stalin held the leadership with the slogan of, quote, "socialism." A massive industrialization process is initiated. The power of the new class is thereby consolidated. In the, quote, undogmatic period, there was collective leadership with the slogan of, quote, "legality." The, quote, "calm maintenance of class society is effectuated with large-scale purges, etc." without large-scale purges, etc. Jesus Christ. With the slogan of, quote, legality, the, quote, calm, maintenance of class society is effectuated without large-scale purges, etc. Milovan Djilas emphasized, however, that this threefold division should be seen only as a rough and abstract schema. Clearly delineated phases did not exist in Milovan Djilas' opinion. Dogmatism also existed under Lenin. Stalin was not a counter-revolutionary, and the undogmatic nature of the collective leadership should, Djilas argued, be relativized. The undogmatic nature of the collective leadership should, Djilas argues, be relativized. Nevertheless, clear shifts had occurred in the course of history. Power, initially considered only a means to an end, had more and more become an end in power's self. In a certain sense, the Soviet system had fulfilled the Soviet system's function. Through industrialization, the new class was now firmly in the saddle, and had thereby reached the new class's goal. Historically, only mediocrity and stagnation could still arise. Clearly, Milovan Djilas added new elements to the theory of bureaucratic collectivism. In contrast to Bruno Rizzi, Milovan Djilas did not characterize the working population as slaves. In contrast to both Bruno Rizzi and James Burnham, Milovan Djilas believed that the bureaucracy was a purely East European and Soviet phenomenon. Finally, Milovan Djilas, in contrast to both Bruno Rizzi, Burnham, and Shachtman, paid close attention to the differences between old ruling classes and the political bureaucracy. Precisely the greater nuance of Djilas' theory shows that the theory of the new ruling class was ultimately difficult to reconcile with the Marxist perspective on history. After all, if the party was the nucleus of a new ruling class, was historical materialism, which interpreted political parties as representatives of social classes and not as social classes' source, not turned on its head. Milovan Djilas recognized the difficulty, referring to a, quote, unusual, end quote, phenomenon, but only stated that, quote, in history it is not important who implements a process. It is only important that the process is implemented, end quote. Footnote. Following the great publicity around Djilas, Bruno Rizzi was also rediscovered in 1958 when Le Contrat Social, the journal edited by old Bolshevik Boris Suvorin, who lived from 1895 to 1984, featured a contribution about, quote, Bruno R. et la, quote, nouvelle classe, end quote. The title seems to refer to an earlier article in the same journal, Lazich, 1957. Here, the Egyptian surrealist Georges Hennin, who lived from 1914 to 73, presented, quote, Bruno R. wrongly as, quote, Bruno Rossi, and referred to Bruno Rizzi's forgotten work, The Bureaucratization of the World, Bureaucratisation du Monde, quote, what Djilas discovered and experienced at the end of a disillusioning personal experience, Bruno Rizzi had proclaimed 18 years earlier in a duel with the living, end quote. It was the beginning of a veritable Rizzi renaissance, which in the 1960s and 1970s led to new publications and translations of Bruno Rizzi's book. See also paragraph 6, section 3. I don't know if that's... In his contribution, Hennin claimed that, quote, R had disappeared without a trace after 1942. Quote, R, ... disappeared forever, probably the victim of one of the razzias by the occupying army, end quote. A false suspicion as it soon turned out. Le Contrat Social shortly thereafter received a personal letter from Bruno Rizzi in which he revealed his true identity. The American Marx scholar and Shachtman supporter Hal Draper, who lived from 1914 to 1990, published a letter in the journal with biographical details about Rizzi. In a second. Yeah, so that's the end of the section. Thank you for listening. That was on Milovan Djilas's conception of Soviet-type societies in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. Thanks for listening.